so the topic of the lecture is economic policies of corporatism and authoritarian political regimes. So I will speak about corporatism as one kind of authoritarian political regime, something that an historical experience that was particularly relevant in my country, in Portugal, during the interwar period, but was also the outcome of other historical experiences, namely in Italy, in France, in Spain, during this same period. So let me just briefly refer to the main motivation and structure of the presentation. So this is about the trying to give some hints on the political rationale of economic and social organization in the interwar years, so between the First and the Second World War, and giving a special attention to, I would say, a less studied and a less known case, which is corporatism, in the context of the emergence of other different authoritarian political regimes in Europe. I will be speaking especially on Western and Southern Europe. I'm not dealing with Eastern Europe, and I'm not dealing with other experiences of authoritarian regimes, namely with the communist political regimes. So this is not a topic of my presentation. And briefly, I will refer to authoritarian political regimes trying to make a difference between authoritarian and what we usually call like fascist regimes. Most of the authoritarian regimes are fascist-like regimes, but the label of fascist that we normally use to fascist Italy in the 30s and to fascist or Nazi Germany in the same period have a different meaning and a different interpretation, although we may consider that the totalitarian and authoritarian regime that took place in Spain or in Portugal in the same periods are fascist-like, let's put this in this way, and have many remembrances in many similitudes with the kind of political regimes that are more known as those that occurred in Italy and in Germany in the 30s, before the emergence of World War II. So although the main focus of the lecture will be the study of corporatism as a doctrine and also as a certain type of economic theory, I will also try to address some of the policy implications of corporatism, although this is not the main topic of the lecture, but I will try to address not only with the old fascist-like corporatist type of regime, but also with the so-called democratic or neo-corporatist regime that took place in many countries in Europe. I would say even after World War II, I will try to give some elements about the development of these social policies as a means to building up the welfare state. And so the connection with between other economic policy regimes and other economic policy doctrines. In this context, I will refer also to a comparative approach between corporatism and Keynesianism, because since the work of Keynes, the work of Keynes is much more known and well known throughout Europe and throughout and is commonly accepted as the major or one of the major figures in the history of economic thought in the 20th century, throughout the 20th century. And so this reference and this comparative approach to Keynes is so that we can have someone or an author with whom we can compare what we are talking about. And so I will not suggest that Keynes can be labeled as a corporatist author, although some of the passage that I will bring to you may show some points of contact. And so I would like to bring this to your attention, since I believe this is a way of putting in context and in a comparative way the kind of approach that I'm bringing to you this evening for you, this afternoon for me here in Lisbon. So the main purpose of this lecture is to present the major features of corporatism its origins, its doubts regarding other schools of thought, its conceptual and doctrinal apparatus, and its main proposals concerning the appropriate balance between individual rights and state responsibilities. Whenever we are talking about the development or the implementation of social policies, we are always doing with this the discussion of this binomial, individual and state, and see how the state can serve individual interests and how the individuals can use the state for getting what they need in order to ameliorate their living conditions. So the first point of this lecture concerns a certain contextualization of corporatism as it appears, and I'm not only referring to Portugal, I'm referring to Portugal, to Spain, to Italy, especially as regards the emergence of a corporatist literature which was quite influential in many countries, and namely in Portugal. And as I will refer briefly later on, as a matter of fact, what the Portuguese authors were saying about corporatism was very much based on the reading of Italian authors, of fascist authors in Italy writing during the 30s. When we refer to this interwar period and to the 20s and the 30s, especially in the 20th century, we witness the existence of several different competing schools of thought that could be roughly divided into major families, those that were pro-capitalist and those that were pro-socialist. And when referring to this kind of doctrines, of course, we have to place corporatism in a sense that it was a kind of political regime or political doctrine that was in favor of capitalism, but was also at the same time very critical of the limitation, the shortcomings and the limits of the capitalism as a social system. And so one of the basic issues that is relevant for the discussion of corporatism is that many times it has presented itself as a kind of a third way system, something that tries to avoid the shortcomings and the bad consequences of political and economic regimes like those of capitalism and socialism. But my point here would be that when we usually refer to schools of economic thought in this, let's say, the first decades of the 20th century, and when we look, for instance, at the way how in textbooks normally the main schools of economic thought are presented and are discussed, we are faced with a kind of developments of neoclassical economics, then a rise of neoclassical economics, and then the emergence of Keynes as a big figure that replaces what was the old paradigm of neoclassical economics. And by saying this, we are losing a lot of things that occurred during the interwar period, not only in theoretical terms. I mean, George Shackle called this period the years of high theory, which means that there was a huge discussion in different political scenarios and in different countries, discussion of theoretical issues related to development of economics as a science. If we look at Wicksell or the Stockholm School, for instance, or if you look at business cycle theory, if you look at the new institutionalists in the United States, those who were concerned with the collection of new data and the treatment, the statistical and econometric treatment of new data, all of these were very important developments that, of course, Keynes has benefited from this very much. It is amazing. I would like to call your attention for a very important book on the fabrication or the fabric of the Keynesian revolution by David Lader, who explains very clearly whom Keynes took as his main references in order to build, no doubt, what we considered to be a major revolution in the history of economic thought. But my point is that we cannot fix the panorama of economic theories by referring only to neoclassical economics and Keynesian economics in the late 20s and the beginning of the 30s. If you look, for instance, apart from this theoretical debate, and I will refer to it in a moment, that took place in this period, also there were many schools of thought, many doctrines, many economic doctrines, which cannot dispute the status of being a new theoretical paradigm, but which were quite relevant in terms of public opinion, in terms of their diffusion throughout Europe in this period. I'm referring to the influence of, for instance, the old institutionalist theories like Veblen, for instance, the German historical school, the organicist and the solidarist schools of thought, and those who were proposing and put forward their ideas on the way how society should be organized. They were not necessarily good economists in theoretical terms, but they were bringing ideas and visions about the way how we can better organize society, and trying to combine economic principles with a vision on the social organization, on the political regime that we should opt for in order to guarantee a better society. So what I mean is that in the early 20th century, before and in the aftermath of the First World War, there is a lot of discussion taking place, not only in theoretical terms, but especially in the doctrinal field, in the doctrinal arena, where institutionalists, organicists, solidarists, different social and economic thinkers were trying to deal with something that was common among those who thought society at the time, was the feeling that there was a profound crisis, a civilization crisis, for which there was the need of new responses to it, and especially in terms of political organization. And I'm always referring, as I said in the beginning, to what is happening in the Western world. So the interwar years therefore witnessed growing doubts about the uncertainty concerning the neoclassical belief in the self-regulating properties of a purely spontaneous market mechanism. And for this, there were different responses. For instance, if you have, and I suppose that I've seen, although I have not had the occasion of following the previous lectures, but I've seen that you had already some of them by our friend and excellent historian of economic thought, Alessandro Roncaglia, who has certainly talked to you about the role that Sraffa has played in the late 20s about this. I mean, he was a precursor in pointing out the critical aspects of the shortcomings of neoclassical theory of price determination and of discussion of the so-called self-regulated market mechanisms. And so the critique of the model of perfect competition that Sraffa put forward in the late 20s was followed by Joan Robinson, by Edward Chamberlain, and all this. There was so a consistent theoretical debate on and a consistent theoretical critique of the main features, on the main tenets of neoclassical economics and its principle of the self-regulating capacity of the market itself. Also, at the time, not in theoretical terms, but in political terms, there was the emergence of, in the 20s, the crazy 20s, as we normally call them. There was a public opinion that was favorable to confer a more significant role to government concerning national economic and social regulation, of course. But there was the feeling that the market itself could not respond to the needs that society was presenting at the time. So there was also the surfacing of new economic systems inspired by different ideological and philosophical presuppositions and pertaining to different national traditions of thought. And so there was this idea that a third way was possible. And it is precisely in this context that I believe that Keynesianism is a case in point and is a special case which deserves attention. I'm not going to deal with it now, but we should not limit the different alternatives and the different in diversity of solutions that were open at the time by considering Keynes as the only one who has put forward an alternative to neoclassical economics and to the doctrines that were fundamental and were at the basis of the neoclassical program in economics. Basically, these authors were dealing with a main problem, which Keynes, of course, has also faced, and for which Keynes has found a new theoretical solution. And the problem was the economic consequences of the Great Depression. So I'm not referring to the other economic consequences that Keynes talk about when he refers to First World War, but he and the general theory of employment, interest, and money is basically a book that tries to give responses, theoretical responses, to what economists should do in order to conceive the functioning of economic reality in terms that neoclassical economics could no longer explain. And so the explanation to what happened after the Great Depression was something that was paramount and was absolutely crucial for Keynes' development, especially in his major book, The General Theory. But however, when we look at what is happening in the 20s and in the 30s in many other countries, most of them without the same background of theoretical developments, we find in doctrinal, in the ideological environment, we find many responses which may not be theoretical, profound and sound, but they were certainly a response that in these countries, in these societies, was trying to be given to the same problems of the turmoil that occurred in economic terms as a consequence of the Great Depression in the late 20s. In the case of the development of corporatist, on which I will develop a bit more in a minute, but the development of this corporatist solution, therefore, benefited from a social and a political atmosphere that was generically favorable to the admission of new solutions for contemporary pressing problems. So, there was a meaningful cluster of previously developed arguments against both socialism and liberalism that are already in place, and that, of course, the corporatist authors took as granted and as a basis at the point of departure for their doctrinal developments. So once again, what I mean is that this is one of the responses that was possible during the interwar years, and especially in the context of the period after the Great Depression in the early 30s. And in this sense, there were many political transformations and changes that occurred, for instance, in Italy, that were also to occur in Germany, and are at the basis of what we know that as being the terrible years of World War II. But long before this period, in the early 30s, there is this a general atmosphere of the sense that there was a need of change, economic change, political change, and a need of dissatisfaction with the usual solutions, both in economic, political, and social terms. In the case of corporatism, when we look at the main arguments presented by corporatist authors, one of the main sources is no doubt the Christian social thought that they could learn from the reading of the papal encyclicals, namely Rerum Novarum by Leon XIII in 1891, And 40 years later, in 1931, the other encyclical, the 41 by Pius XI. And why was this important? Because these texts from Christian social thought were addressing one of the main issues that corporatist authors will try to solve, which is the so-called social questions. And the social question, I mean the evils that were and the negative consequences coming from the capitalist a capitalist economy, especially trying to address the issue of the mutual rights and duties of capital and labor, and how capital and labor could harmonize and be together in order to ameliorate the misery situation of working classes. And so the notion of solidarity that should exist between those who are in the economic organization linked to capital and those that were linked to labor. So this solidarity and the subsidiarity of their contributions, and also the revival of the fight against the evils of liberal capitalism and also of communism, as it is clearly seen, especially in the encyclical of Pius XI in 1931, the 41 encyclical. It is clear that this encyclical is addressed against both liberal capitalism and against communism. And so it is precisely this environment, this doctrinal environment of Christian social thought in Portugal, as you may understand, in southern Europe, Portugal, Spain, in Italy. This was quite relevant because they were basically Catholic societies in which the weight of the Pope's message was really quite important. So this is one of the main sources of inspiration of corporatism as something that tries to bring together and in a way of solidarity and harmony, capital and labor. Also, there was at the time a kind of nationalist, institutionalist, historicist and organicist revival and the arguments around the existence of a new economic reality that could no longer be explained by orthodox economics. So corporatists were happy with the fact that there were so many critics of the neoclassical economic model, because indeed they believe that the self-regulatory mechanisms in economic life could not function. And so the idea of having the market and self-regulated market as the final response to get equilibrium between the different economic agents that participate in economic life, this was something that could not be accepted because it simply did not work in this way. So also there were at the time, and this is the link with the authoritarian regimes and the link with fascism and the link with dictatorships that occurred in these countries, like in Italy, like in Spain with the regime of Franco, and like in Portugal with the regime of Salazar in the 30s. And what I mean is that there was this arguments that thought that of a critique of democratic parliamentarism, a critique of the usual means of political representation in democratic societies. And so there were political arguments against this form of political representation. And they considered in this way that the existence of an authoritarian state and of an authoritarian leader, maybe less in the case of Portugal and Spain than as we see with Il Duce with Mussolini in Italy and with Hitler in Germany. Not at the same level, I would say, but in the same mood, we see the political critique of parliamentary regimes, and so the creation of political arguments for the legitimization of authoritarianism, of dictatorship, of fascist-like regimes in Southern Europe throughout the 30s. Also, the idea that is typical of the corporatist authors and in this sense, they try to cope from the encyclical messages from the popes, is that class struggle is not a device, a theoretical device explaining or that we can use to understand the tensions in society. And so instead of promoting class struggle as a device for explaining the changes that should occur in society, these authors try to speak much more about the harmony, the coordination, the convergence of different interests between the different players in economic life. So we are approaching in this lecture the moment in which I will try to bring some, not exactly a definition, but try to give you some elements in order to explain what was, in practical terms, this ideology and this doctrine of corporatism. So, summing up, it was seen as a third way alternative, not against capitalism per se, but against the evils or the extremes of capitalism. So it was against extreme individualism, extreme democracy, extreme abstraction, extreme materialism, and extreme liberalism. And of course, they were also against socialism. But this is the other. So the third way is a third way within the spirit of a capitalist society, a capitalist economy that tries to criticize what are the negative consequences of the organization or the belief in the market as a self-regulated mechanism. And so, in order to build this model of a new society, they need also a new philosophical argument, a new philosophical background. And so, we can summarize this new notion by explaining that these authors try to understand economic agency, economic man, not as in terms of the traditional homo economicus, I mean, in terms of rationality of behavior of economic agents, by which when we refer to homo economicus tradition, we are referring to the idea that the economy is organized on the basis of individuals who try in a rational way conceive what are the best means and instruments they have at their disposal in order to reach their aims, their targets, and they can rationalize and they can rationally use these different options and these different ways of economic allocation in order to reach their interests, their benefits, and especially to maximize their benefits. So this is the typical philosophical background of the so-called homo economicus, but what they are really doing, the corporatist thinkers in this period, and I use here especially what they are saying in my country, in Portugal, as I will try to give you some quotations in order to illustrate this his way of thinking, is precisely this idea of that the man is naturally collaborative, is naturally willing to cooperate. And the homo corporativus is an expression that they use to explain that instead of having each one fighting for its own objectives and for the maximization of its own of its benefits and of its profits, what we have is the spirit of cooperation, the spirit of harmony, the spirit of solving the tensions by in the marketplace putting together labor and capital, different agents, different participations in the market, and there is a spirit of constructing together the nation and in the state as a main interpret of what are the needs of this nation, which is built of different individuals which are not fighting against each other, but which are trying to bring cooperation among them. So this is an ideological, a doctrinal main source for what they are trying to describe when they refer to the need of having corporations as the basic element or one of the basic elements of economic life. So, to sum up, individuals are members of a natural organic whole. So there is a kind of an organism in which all play, of course, a part, different parts, but they play it in a way that is not through the struggle but between individuals, groups, or classes, but is much more, or should be much more, the result or the outcome of a natural harmony and a natural way of expressing interests in a way that is not seen by others as competitive, but as a result of collaboration. Summing up, and I will use here a quotation from the well-known dictator in Portugal in this period, Salazar. What I've been saying. So in political terms, the leader of the regime was expressing his own ideas of what he thought that the social and economic system should be. He says that we want to move to a new economy, working in harmony with human nature, under the authority of a strong state that defends the nation's superior interests, its health and its work, both against capitalist excesses and destructive Bolshevism. So it's once and again the idea that there is a third way, a new economy, which is between capitalism, the excesses of capitalism, and the destructive nature of Bolshevism, of communism. And so he's bringing to his audience the idea that it is possible to have a new economy. And by this he means a new way of organizing economic life, which is not based on self-interest and on the notion of a self-regulated economy. And as I will try to give you another quotation from another Portuguese author of this period, but rather not a self-regulated market mechanism, but a self-directed economy in which the state and the individuals are in the same communion of interests and of benefits. So the corporatist organization of society was expected to achieve goals of social harmony and equilibrium, entrusting the state with a primary role in leading the whole process in order to effectively control economic and social life. So the essence of the corporatist doctrine is based on the subjection of the individual to the superior interests of the nation, with the main aim of safeguarding social order and political stability. So the individual is not given the capacity of expressing its own interests, but his own interests are expressed through the national interest, which is interpreted by the state. And therefore, so the main construction of corporatism is a social and a philosophical construction in which the individual loses its capacity to express in the market his own or her own capabilities and interests. The incentive for the creation of corporations embodied a logic of social and economic organization in which the realization of the general interest was previously measured by harmonizing the interests of different agents and groups of agents operating in a market which is overseen, controlled by the state. The fixing of prices, the entry of new firms into the market, the regulation of the working conditions, the determination of wage levels, the analysis of production costs, and generally speaking, all the operations that involve the use of economic calculation, economic reasoning, which under a system of free competition represent the basic procedures in the choices that can be made within the context of a scarcity of available resources. I mean, the main economic problem, which is how can we deal with the scarcity of economic resources in order to realize our interest and to maximize our benefits, this is completely out of the panorama, the theoretical framework that corporatist authors present. All of this is, on the contrary, the basis for the constitution of the corporations, which are institutions that put together the owners of capital and the workers in the same work plant. Let's put it this way. And so there are a kind of a federative organizations which are organized in terms of on the basis of the different products and the different sectors that constitute the economy. For instance, the guilds is the kind of a guild or cooperative system, which have the representatives of the different economic firms operating in the market, and there is a kind of a horizontal and vertical control of all of their functioning. So we are not speaking about a kind of a quinquennial plan like we have in Soviet Russia, for instance, maybe later or in the same period, but we have this idea of an organization of activities, both in horizontal and vertical ways, in which the corporations are the basic institutional unit, which is organized in terms of the working of capital and labor in certain fields of activity. Let me give you an example. For wheat, for instance, or rice, or olive oil, or wine production, or textile production, for instance, what we have is, apart from the firms, we have a corporation, which is the representation of workers and capital of these firms in a kind of organization, and then you have the federation of these organizations, which establish the wage level, the price of at which the products will be sold in the market, the way the rules and the norms to which workers and capital should respond, and the general institutional framework that is provided by the state. So this is an ideal system in which all the economic mechanisms that usually are the outcome of the functioning of the market, the self-regulated market in an economy as described by neoclassical economics, is no longer what the corporatist authors consider as the basis of the armory that should exist in society. For them, this armory is only possible if we have a kind of corporations, institutions that merge, that put together the players in a certain field of activity. So they were opponents of laissez-faire, opponents of the capacity of individuals to express their own interest, and they took this notion of a self-directed economy, which, however, had nothing to do with the mechanisms leading to spontaneous equilibrium of the market that were at the basis of neoclassical economics, but this self-directed economy was something that was, after all, the outcome of the presence of the state as the main institution to guarantee this equilibrium that was trying to be built through corporations. So corporatists believe that there should be this intermediate bodies of corporations in an economy, in a society, which was the best way to put together and organize the different interests in this society. Let me give you, although it's a long quotation, but I think that it summarizes quite well the main issues that I'm trying to discuss with you. Corporations, therefore, collaborate in the performance of a normative role. And this is why the activities of individuals and companies are now subjected to a form of discipline, or better still, are conditioned by certain initial positions that are implied by this discipline. We are far removed from automatic equilibrium. Instead of this, we have a directed economy. So this is the basic opponent. We do not believe in the automatic equilibrium of the market or through the market. We have a directed economy, which means that there is a kind of norm that is imposed on the function of this economy. But in this case, such control does not belong directly to the state. For it is the industries that through their corporation, and you can take the industries or the agriculture, if you consider the production of wine or the production of wheat or the production of olive oil, etc. So it is the industries that through their corporation take the initiative of drawing up the rules and regulations. Afterwards, it is the task of the government as the representative of the national interest to decide upon these rules in the last instance, either approving them or rejecting them. Now, since the industries collaborate in their own discipline, it is said that we have instead a self-directed economy. So my point so far is just to give you some economic rationale, some economic reasoning of this way of conceiving an economy, which is not based, although being a capitalist economy, is not a self-regulated market economy, but it is a self-directed economy, which means that the imposition of norms is not should not be seen as an authoritarian regime, but should be seen as the outcome of the wishes of the players in this economy, both workers and capital owners, who together in the corporations were trying to merge and converge their interests. So what we have here is the idea of a new economic and social order. The corporations being a suitable environment for the collaboration and harmony between capital and labor. Once again, the idea that class struggle should not be the guiding principle of our conception of society, but instead we have the harmony and equilibrium between the different players. And property rights and private entrepreneurship would fulfill a national function. Individual owners and entrepreneurs would be responsible for ensuring that national interests and aims were actually achieved. So it is on the benefit of the nation and of the functioning of the old system that there is a kind of self-control of the activities of those who participate in the economic process. I think it is important to take here into consideration something that I will talk a bit later on, the notion of the work plant, if you want, or the firm or the companies as a kind of community of labor. This is a term that was used by Francois Peru, a French economist, who wrote a very important book in 1937 on these same issues, La Communauté du Travail, the community of labor, which brings us to this idea that we should not see an economy functioning through tensions, conflicts, contradictions, either between the world of labor and the world of capital, but even among individual agents or firms trying to compete for their best position in the market. So the economy should be conceived as something that is always controlled by the state. We have also a comprehensive doctrine of the function of the and organization of the nation. A set of appropriate hierarchical relationships between the whole and its constituent parts will be firmly secured through the system of corporations and the federation of different corporations. An ideal balance between individual freedom and national aims, since the prevalence of the general over the particular did not imply that men had to be entirely absorbed or dissolved by society. So it's once and again this idea of the harmony of interest between different individuals. Needless to say that all this project was a failure. I mean, this idea of having an economy and a society organized on the basis of the corporations established at the level of the product, in the coordination both in horizontal and vertical terms, having the corporation and the Federation of Corporations as the basic elements of organizing the economy did not occur in Portugal and in any part of the world following this doctrinaire and this ideological framework that the corporatist authors were trying to put forward. So what happened was, in the case of Portugal at least, was the replacement of this self-directed economy by a directed authoritarian economy, which means that the corporations did not work out as they were supposed to do, and so the state had to replace the work that was done by that should be done by the corporations. So you may ask, but why have I been losing all this time and all this Latin explaining something that after all did not occur? Because what I believe is that what is relevant is that this is a kind of approach which shows alternative ways of thinking the same problem that other economists were putting forward at the time, which means the bad functioning of a capitalist economy, in which we should not be no longer believe, because it has already been proved that economic agents left to the rapacity and to only giving them the opportunity to fight for their own interests. This is no longer possible. We need a strong state. And as we will see about when speaking about Keynes also believed that the state had an economic role to play, much more important than it was given by new classical economics. So I'm not suggesting that we are in the same family of authors. The philosophical and the ideological and doctrinal sources may be radically different, but we are in the same. We are experiencing the same kind of dissatisfaction with the bad functioning of market, self-regulated market, as they were conceived by new classical economics. And so we are not only criticizing the fundamentals of this new classical model, I mean the Homo economicus tradition, replacing it by an Homo corporativus philosophical ground, new philosophical ground, which is the appeal for the harmony of interests, etc. And what is interesting is that although this could not happen in the terms that were idealized by the visionaries and by the doctrinaires of corporatism, there were lessons for the future. And there were, of course, some of the aspects of their doctrines that were accepted and that they were in a certain way followed up by other authors that in a different political situation, in a different political framework, used the same arguments to try to defend the same concept of organizing a society, not on the basis of the conflict, but should be rather on the basis of harmony and convergence of interests. When we talk about all this period and in speaking about the case of Portugal, of course there is a huge literature on these different topics. The name of the last author, the Portuguese author Ribeiro, he was a professor of law at the University of Coimbra, and he is one of the major thinkers on the corporatist system, not only in legal and juridical terms, but also in economic and political terms. Also, another Portuguese author who was very much influential and important in thinking the sources of corporatism was, apart from Salazar, was the one who succeeded Salazar, who the political the prime minister who succeeded Salazar named Caetano, Marcelo Caetano. He was also one of the leaders of in the 30s and the 40s of this doctrinal movement in defense of corporatism. But of course they were inspired especially by Italian economic literature. And here this is not the only book that Ugo Spirito, an Italian author, has written about corporatism, but he was both in the 30, 32, and 34. He wrote very important books on the economics of corporatism, and I'm referring here to this one because this one was translated into Portuguese and was basically where the Portuguese author were inspired and have learned on these notions of homo corporativus, for instance. Another author who was quite influential was the Romanian Mihail Manoilescu, who wrote in 1934 a very influential book in Southern Europe. And it's amazing that the book was also quite influential in many Latin American countries. I suppose that you have Carlos Suprignac speaking about with you maybe tomorrow or one of these days on development theories. And there is a very interesting link between the development theories for Latin America and for ECLA, for the Economic Commission in Latin America, created in the late 40s in the context of the United Nations, and Manoilescu's ideas of development and economic policies were very much, I wouldn't say followed or inspired, in inspiring influence in the Latin American developmentist authors, but there is certain links which are quite interesting. Although he, in the 30s, wrote this book in which he tried to anticipate, once again, a big failure, because he was, once again, we are facing a big failure, because he thought that the 20th century would be the century, not the century of socialism, not the century of capitalism, but the century of corporatism. He failed totally in his expectation of what the world would be throughout the 20th century, but he is giving a defense, a heartful defense of corporatism as a third way system, as an alternative to what capitalism and socialism or capitalism and communism could not give to as a hope for the development of society in the Western world. And finally, an author who was also very interesting in this period, Francois Peru, a French professor of law and economics, with a close link to the Vichy regime, to the fascist regime in France during the occupation, during the World War II. There is a certain difficulty by French authors to deal with Peru because he had then a democratic learning, and after the war he played a very important role in the French university system, and of course he made his only only process of democratization, and so he get rid of his the influences that he received in his youth. But it is curious that, for instance, Peru has taught a course of political economy in Portugal immediately after Salazar left the faculty of law in Coimbra, and he was in a certain way the successor of the cátedra, of the professorship of Salazar at Coimbra. And so, and he visited Portugal, as he visited Italy, and as he visited Spain, in order to get information about the experiences of authoritarian regimes that were taking place and corporatist regimes that were taking place in Europe at the time. And Peru did not call, as the other authors called this economy or this century, the corporatist state or the corporatist economy. He talked about capitalism and about communauté du travail, the community of labor. And this, it is precisely this notion that I believe it's quite relevant to build up a new wave of corporatism, a democratic corporatism, which conceives human relations in the firms as the basic element to build this convergence and this harmony of interests, etc. So I'm not suggesting that these are the only authors who are relevant, at least for the case of Portugal, but these would be the readings of original sources that I would recommend if you want to understand better what were the main tenets of corporatism in the 30s as they were received, namely in Portugal at the time. So let's move to a point which is also necessary in order to understand what would be, even if corporatism failed in its original conception, of course, the rhetoric of corporatism was kept alive, and it was around this rhetoric that many of the state interventions and social policies were drawn and were implemented. And so to strengthen the spirit of cooperation and mutual help between producers through the establishment of intercorporative agreements with a capacity to determine technical rules and standards, fix prices and wages, and reduce production costs. So the state played here a role in order to impose rules to the functioning of the market. And although the corporations did not exist, it was the state itself that imposed these rules among producers and among consumers. And also it was necessary to create a certain discipline and an effective control over the production process through the harmonious combination of the various corporative plans so as to prevent extreme fluctuations of supply in relation to demand. So the main concern as far as the development of economic policies was concerned in Portugal during the 30s was precisely the role that the state should do to replace what was supposed to be the role of corporations in the Federation of Corporations. The spirit was the same, to impose rules that prevented the capitalist spirit, the capitalist self-regulated spirit could operate. So to lessen the negative effects of the system of free competition and to fix the limits and barriers to the entry of new firms in certain sectors of economic activity, which would thereby bring about the possibility of a certain distortion in one of the fundamental bases of the capitalist system. I mean, the determination of market equilibrium price. So there was no longer the possibility of market prices being the outcome of the function of the market, because the market price was fixed by the state, and so there was imposition of the prices that should be respected by economic agents. Let me give you an example of what was done in terms of industrial policy. There was a regime in Portugal in the 30s which was called the industrial conditioning. What does this mean? This means that if I, as owner of capital, want to create an industry in textile sector, for instance, or metallo-mechanic sector whatsoever, I need to follow a bureaucratic process according to which I have to apply for the state in order to have a license to create my firm, my company. And this industrial conditioning means that the state can create the rules and the norms that allow or not allow me to enter in this economic sector. And so there were barriers to the entry of new agents, of new companies in certain sectors, which implied that there were a kind of monopoly or oligopoly structure organized under the conditions that were established by the state. And so this was the way how the authoritarian political regime in Portugal in the 30s and in the 40s has created very strict rules that imposed and conditioned the creation of new firms and new companies appearing in the market. And therefore, even if the self-directed economy was not the outcome of the functioning of the corporations, it was the state that created the instruments and the mechanisms through which this self-directed economy, or this directed economy was imposed. So limits to free competition, limits to entry in the market, to limits to the creation, to the economic creation, into economic innovation. As regards the implementation of social policy measures, namely as regards social security, healthcare, poor relief, unemployment aid, basically, and if I take the Portuguese case in the 30s, of course, all this implied a certain innovation and a certain progressive innovation, since it implied legal duty of social protection of society itself as a whole, and not only in individual terms. And so corporatists, or the defenders of corporatism, establish a kind of a patronizing and a charitable social protection system of law, based on law and order, based on the idea of social peace, or the proposal of social peace, but in which there was no responsibility of the state to create these social security mechanisms to guarantee health care, or unemployment aid, or children's protection, or pensions for elderly people, etc. So this should be, once again, the outcome, the natural outcome of the functioning of the corporations, or the individuals and the agents, both from the side of capital and labor, that were willing to create, in the context of the firms and of the corporations, this social security attempts to solve the typical problems of welfare in a modern capitalist society, but they did not feel that the state, I'm speaking about the 30s and the 40s, that the state should compromise in order to create a system that was a real guarantee of the functioning of social protection. Nevertheless, after the war, as I was trying to explain, since corporatism did fail as an institutionalized system, but did not fail as an idea, we see that there are new developments, a new wave of corporatism, in which the authors who were defending corporatism were no longer defending the corporations as the basic institutional unit for the functioning of economy and society, but they were thinking of the corporatist idea as a basic, a founding element of social harmony, human relations, reconciliation of interests, etc. And so, in the context of the post-World War, after the World War II, there is, of course, a new attitude as regards also the development of social policies. But in this sense, they are much more close to the influence, for instance, of ideas coming from other European countries, and namely the influence of the Beveridge Plan and what occurred in what was occurring in Europe in the context of the social and economic development on the period of reconstruction after the war. And of course, here, and this is the point that I would like to raise now, it is clear that the door was open in Portugal after the war also to the influence of Keynes, who was quite influential, and whose influence was, together with these ideas of genuine goodwill put forward by corporatist authors who believed that society should be built on the basis of reconciliation of interests, social harmony, not conflicts between groups and classes. Keynes played a very important role, and this is the final topic I would like to address with you from now on. Is it possible for more 15 minutes, Dennis? I think it's okay.
Well, I would say 10, maybe.
Okay, so I will speed up. So the point, and I will be brief on this. The point is that the convergence with Keynes and between Keynes and corporatism can be of course, well explained, because also Keynes considered that laissez-faire was neither a moral absolute nor a guiding principle for an ideal economic system. And so Keynes, you look at this quotation, said that capitalism wisely managed can probably be made more efficient for attaining economic ends than any alternative system yet in sight, but that in itself it is in many ways extremely objectionable. Our problem is to work out a social organization which shall be as efficient as possible without offending our notions or a satisfactory way of life. Keynes wrote this in his famous text, The End of Laissez-Faire, in which he is criticizing laissez-faire and market capitalism as a basic philosophical principle for organizing an economy and a society. And so he's trying to say that capitalism serves, but it needs to be reformed, and we need a new type of organization. So Keynes defended that progress lies in the growth and the recognition of a semi-autonomous bodies within the state. He doesn't call corporations, but the idea of corporatism is precisely this idea of semi-autonomous bodies within the state, bodies whose criterion of action within their own field is solely the public good as they understand it, and from whose deliberations motives of private advantages are excluded. So the idea that in the end of laissez-faire, in this famous text Keynes is presenting, is some way, in a certain way, convergent with the criticism that the corporatists were giving against the functioning of a capitalist society on the basis of the defense of self-interest. And finally, and this is what we can see in the famous preface of the German translation of the general theory of employment, interest and money, published in the very same year when it was published in English. So the preface to the German translation, Keynes wrote the following statement. The theory of output as a whole, which is what the following book proposes to provide, I mean, the general theory, is much more easily adapted to the conditions of a totalitarian state than is the theory of production and distribution of a given output produced under conditions of free competition and the larger measure of laissez-faire. I'm not suggesting here that Keynes was defending an authoritarian state against democratic regimes, but of course we can see that these views presented by Keynes are in a certain way compatible with a certain kind of societal corporatism, according to which the newly acquired decision authority of corporations should be subject to the sovereignty of democracy expressed through parliament. So Keynes still believes that, of course, political institutions, representative institutions, democratic institutions should serve as the final element to control the functioning of this societal corporatism. But these views were useful in order to reinforce the criticism directed against classical economics views, and also proves to be a useful approach for convincing people of the importance of state economic intervention. Notwithstanding Keynes' work gave rise to a series of economic policy guidelines that it would be almost impossible to be accepted by corporatism, especially those associated to budget deficits and active management of effectual demand. So summing up what I'm trying to bring here, and I believe I have not time enough to go into in depth in these quotations presented in Keynes' work, is that although we can have a kind of a convergence in terms of the criticism that both corporatists and Keynes present to the functioning of a so-called self-regulated economy, and even if Keynes is favorable to this semi-autonomous bodies which function in articulation with the state, of course, there are limits that Keynes could not accept, and these limits are the very function of political institutions and the belief that for him was a sacred belief in the representative system of democracy, which was the guarantee of functioning of the type of economic system that he was defending. Just to conclude, Keynesian corporatist thinkers were likely to converge insofar as they shared a common enemy, the old-fashioned liberal views, and also insofar as they both tried to find relief for the kind of economic inefficiency and associated social turmoil that was likely to emerge out of the workings of an uncontrolled market system. But the contents and forms of such intervention do, however, have quite distinct characteristics, namely because the array of changes that were advanced by Keynes was obviously less demanding than those required by corporatist thinkers. What I mean is that Keynes did not get along with the basic corporatist philosophical conceptions or with their proposals for a comprehensive ethical reorganization of economic and social life, which was, after all, what corporatism was about this ideal way of organizing economic and social life. It was only after the war, when the war was over and corporatism began to collapse, that Keynes' economic ideas finally acted as a kind of a realistic alternative to the previous corporatist comprehensive ambitions, namely amongst those who still wanted the state to be directly involved in the strategy of industrial development. So what happened is in most of European countries, of Southern European countries, including Portugal, is that the mixture of Keynesian arguments in terms of economic policy was possible in a political regime that, being authoritarian and being not according to democratic representation rules, could be accepted, these Keynesian ideas, because they serve the purpose of putting in relevance the role that the state should perform in order to promote the development of economic policies devoted to foster development and to foster economic growth. And as a matter of fact, what happened in Portugal, and I cannot develop it here, is that in the 50s and the 60s, it was really possible to have an increase of the GDP per capita, which was above the average in Europe during the 60s, which was the outcome of this mixture of Keynesian policies with this ideological corporatist vision, which was very important in social terms, according to which the different interests of the different players could be put together. Let me just to close with three short references. One is a paper I published a few years ago on this notion of homo corporativus, and this will give you a basic idea of the different influences that were received by Portuguese authors, but also how it was developed by the Italian authors who thought about homo corporativus. There is a paper and I'm giving these two references because they are just quite fresh and quite new. One is in the European Journal of History of Economic Thought, the latest issue. It has been just published a very interesting article on Francois Peru and on his notion of community of labor, and which discusses very lengthy the implications of Peru to the Vichy regime, and also this implication with this diversity of alternative currents that were in the 30s and the 40s discussing alternative critiques to neoclassical economics. And finally, there is a very interesting book just came out, which has the date of 21 as the date of publication, but it has already came out, which is edited by Carlos Suprignac and Alexandre Cunha, on the political economy and international order in interwar Europe, and which gives you in during the interwar period this amazing picture of different visions, including corporatism, which, just to come again to the beginning of my lecture, which show very clearly that in the history of economic thought of the period, we cannot consider Keynes as the only alternative to new classical economics. There were other current streams of thought that, although not being coherently assessed by their authors in terms of in theoretical terms, they were nevertheless inspiring doctrinal and philosophical streams of thought that proved to be useful for the implementation of social policies, especially in the context of the post-World War. I think it's it, and of course I will be ready to ask any questions you may have. Thank you very much for your attention.